Blood makes a different pattern on snow than it does on dirt. Spreads slower, stays brighter, like God's own accusation. Montana, 1920. Winter has teeth here, and memories are carved into the mountains like epitaphs. A woman stands at her window, watching 5 riders approach through swirling white. Her fingers find the cold steel of her husband's service revolver, a relic from a war that never really ended for those who survived it. They come for her cattle, her livelihood. But they don't understand what they're truly facing. Some say revenge is a dish best served cold. Up here, everything is cold. Breath freezes, hearts harden. Choices narrow to a single, brutal truth. In a blizzard, there are no witnesses, no laws except survival, no judge but the storm itself. When men with blood on their hands corner a widow with nothing left to lose, they should remember one thing. Sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one that roars. It's the one that waits, silent in the storm. Montana, 1920. The stark winter landscape was broken only by the weathered buildings of the Callahan Ranch, standing defiant against the endless white. The distant mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their snow-capped peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised more snow before nightfall. Sarah Callahan stood at her kitchen window, her face as impassive as the frozen land outside. At 42, she wore her years with quiet dignity. Her once auburn hair was streaked with silver, pulled back in a practical bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and penetrating blue eyes. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something arresting about her, a stillness, a self-possession that commanded attention. She was cleaning her husband's old service revolver when she first spotted them, 5 riders approaching from the east, dark smudges against the snow. Something in their formation, the purposeful way they moved, made her stomach tighten. These weren't neighbors coming to call. "Mr. Jenkins," she called, her voice steady. "We have company." The old man who had worked for the Callahans since before the war appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. Jenkins was 70 if he was a day, but he stood straight, his weathered face creased with concern as he peered out the window. "Don't like the look of them, Mrs. Callahan," he muttered. "Neither do I." Sarah slid the revolver into her apron pocket. "Go to the barn. If you hear trouble, take the back trail to Sheriff Thompson's place." Jenkins nodded, though they both knew the sheriff's office was a half-day's ride in good weather. In this snow, it might as well be on the moon. Sarah watched the riders approach, her face betraying nothing of the calculations running through her mind. 5 men, likely armed. The cattle in the north pasture, her entire livelihood, would be visible from the ridge they'd just crossed. The lead rider was a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing even beneath his heavy coat. As they drew closer, Sarah could make out his face beneath a battered cavalry hat, middle-aged, with a thick mustache, frosted white at the edges, and eyes that had seen too much. The war, she guessed. It had left its mark on so many men. Behind him rode a younger man with a sharp, ferrety face and spectacles that gave him an incongruously scholarly appearance. Then a hulking brute, whose dull eyes suggested limited intelligence but considerable strength. The fourth was nondescript, unremarkable, except for the nervous way he kept scanning the surroundings. The fifth, trailing behind as if reluctant to be associated with the others, was younger, perhaps mid-20s, with a shock of dark hair visible beneath his hat and shoulders that hunched against more than just the cold. Sarah stepped onto the porch as they reined in, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She didn't reach for the gun. Not yet. "Afternoon, ma'am," the leader said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Fine piece of land you've got here." "It serves its purpose," Sarah replied, her voice neutral. "What brings you gentlemen to my ranch?" The man smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Name's Max Harlan. My associates and I are cattle buyers. Heard you might have a herd worth looking at." It was a lie, and they both knew it. No legitimate cattle buyer traveled with such men or appeared unannounced in the dead of winter. "My cattle aren't for sale, Mr. Harlan," Max's smile didn't waver, but something hardened in his eyes. "Now, that's a shame, Mrs. Callahan, Sarah Callahan." A flicker of recognition crossed Max's face. "Callahan? Any relation to Captain Robert Callahan, 91st Infantry?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but her hand moved imperceptibly closer to her pocket. "My late husband." "Well, now," Max said, dismounting with a creak of leather, "ain't that something? The captain and I had some acquaintance during the war." He glanced at his companions. "Boys, we've stumbled on the widow of a genuine hero." The men exchanged looks that made Sarah's pulse quicken. There was history here, and nothing good. "My husband has been gone 2 years, Mr. Harlan. Whatever business you had with him died with him." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Max replied, taking a step forward. "See, your husband and I had an understanding that was never quite resolved. I know nothing of my husband's wartime dealings." "Don't you?" Max's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I heard. In fact, I heard the captain shared everything with his nurse-turned-wife. Everything." A sudden shot cracked the winter silence. Sarah flinched, turning toward the barn where the sound had originated. For a terrible moment, nothing moved. Then Mr. Jenkins stumbled out, clutching his chest, crimson blossoming between his fingers. He took 3 faltering steps before collapsing face first into the snow. Sarah moved to go to him, but Max was faster, grabbing her arm with iron fingers. "I wouldn't," he said softly. "Vern's a fine shot. He never misses twice." She looked past Max to see the unremarkable 4th man lowering a rifle, his expression unchanged, as if he hadn't just taken a human life. "Now," Max continued, his voice conversational, "let's talk about those cattle, Mrs. Callahan, and about what else your husband might have left behind." The barn had always been Sarah's sanctuary. Even in the bitter cold of Montana winters, there was something comforting about its cavernous space, the smell of hay and animal warmth, the soft lowing of cattle. Now it was desecrated. Max's men had driven a portion of her herd, 20 head of prime beef cattle, into the barn and slaughtered a young heifer on the spot. Blood steamed in the cold air as they butchered it with practiced efficiency, building a fire in the central clearing where the dirt floor was packed hard from years of use. Sarah stood near the door, her back straight, her face set in lines of stone as she watched them work. Jenkins' body lay where it had fallen, already dusted with fresh snow. They wouldn't let her move him. "Nothing like fresh beef, eh, Mrs. Callahan?" Max called from where he supervised the butchering. He seemed to be enjoying himself, like a cruel child pulling wings off flies. "Been living on jerky and hardtack too long." Sarah said nothing. The revolver was gone, taken from her pocket when they searched her. Her mind was clear, calculating, assessing. 5 armed men, the nearest neighbor miles away. A snowstorm brewing. The situation could not be worse, or perhaps it could. "You boys ever taste what real money can buy?" Max was saying to his men. "In Paris during the war I had a steak so tender you could cut it with a fork, served with wine that cost more than your mother's would fetch at auction." Laughter from the men, all except the youngest, the dark-haired one who hung back from the others. He caught Sarah's eye briefly, then looked away, a flush of something like shame coloring his gaunt cheeks. The ferret-faced man with spectacles was examining the barn with professional interest. "Solid construction," he commented. "German design, if I'm not mistaken. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore." "Jimmy here fancies himself an educated man," Max explained to Sarah. "Reads books, wrote for newspapers during the war, a regular philosopher." His tone made it clear what he thought of such pretensions. Jimmy adjusted his spectacles. "Knowledge is never wasted, Max." He turned to Sarah. "Your husband built this place?" "My husband and I," Sarah replied. Her first words since they'd forced her into the barn. "Robert designed it. I helped raise it." A woman who can build, the brute, introduced earlier as Lyle, guffawed. "What else can you do besides wield a hammer?" Sarah didn't dignify the insinuation with a response. She was watching the sky through the open barn door. The clouds were lowering, thickening. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally now. Weather was changing faster than expected. Jimmy followed her gaze. "Storm's coming in," he observed. "Just a squall," Max dismissed. "We've got shelter, fire, food. We're better off than we've been in weeks." The young man finally spoke, his voice soft. "It's more than a squall, Max. Look at those clouds." Max turned to him, irritation flashing across his face. "Nobody asked you, Turner. Keep your mouth shut unless you're spoken to." So the young one was named Turner. Sarah filed the information away. The men had the fire going strong now, the flames casting grotesque shadows on the barn walls. They'd butchered enough meat for a feast, setting cuts to roast on improvised spits. The rich smell of cooking beef filled the air, mingling obscenely with the coppery scent of blood. Max approached Sarah, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hungry, Mrs. Callahan? You should eat. It's your beef, after all." "I've lost my appetite. Suit yourself." He studied her face. "You know, you're not what I expected. Robert Callahan's wife. The way he talked about you, I pictured someone more fragile." Sarah met his gaze evenly. "My husband knew me better than that." "Did he now?" Max smiled thinly. "I wonder, men keep all sorts of secrets, especially from their wives." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah refused to take the bait. "You should move your men," she said instead. "That storm will block the mountain pass by morning." Max laughed. "Trying to scare us off? Nice try, Mrs. Callahan, but we're staying put. In fact, we're taking your entire herd when we leave. Consider it payment for a debt your husband owed me." "My husband owed you nothing. That's where you're wrong." Max's smile vanished. "Your heroic husband cost me everything, my commission, my reputation, my future, all because he couldn't keep his damn mouth shut about what happened at Argonne." The Argonne Forest, the final offensive of the war. Robert had spoken of it rarely and never in detail. Whatever had happened there had haunted him until his death. "You'll have to take that up with him," Sarah said coldly. "I hear hell has an open-door policy." Max's hand whipped out, faster than she could react, catching her across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. Pain exploded in her cheek, and she tasted blood. "Mind your tongue, woman," he growled, "before I decide to cut it out." Sarah straightened slowly, turning to face him again. She didn't touch her cheek, didn't acknowledge the blow in any way. Only the slight tightening of her eyes betrayed her rage. Blood slowly dripped from her split lip, falling to mix with the heifer's blood on the barn floor. Snow swirled in through the open door, tiny crystals catching the firelight before melting in the pooled blood. She watched the blood and snow mingle, crimson and white, life and death. Then, without a word, she turned and walked to the far corner of the barn, as far from Max and his men as she could get, while still within their sight. Behind her the feast continued, the men growing rowdier as they ate and passed a bottle between them. Their laughter echoed off the barn walls, a harsh counterpoint to the rising moan of the wind outside. Sarah stood motionless, her back to them, her eyes fixed on the storm beyond the barn door. To anyone watching, she might have appeared defeated, resigned. They couldn't see her face, couldn't see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the plans forming and being discarded, the assessments of men and weather and survival. Sarah Callahan had buried a husband and a child. She had survived a war and a pandemic. She had built a life from nothing in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in America. These men had no idea what they were dealing with. By nightfall, the storm had announced itself in earnest. The wind howled around the barn like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice, driving needles of cold through the sturdy walls. Snow accumulated in drifts against the doors, and the temperature plummeted. Max's men had consumed most of the butchered heifer, along with a fair amount of whiskey from their saddlebags. They sprawled around the fire in various states of intoxication, except for Turner, who'd barely touched his meat and declined the bottle entirely, and Jimmy, who nursed a single cup and watched the others with detached amusement. Sarah remained in her corner, sitting now with her back against the wall, conserving energy. They hadn't offered her food again, and she hadn't asked. Hunger was an old friend. It could be ignored. Max approached, carrying a tin plate with a chunk of meat and a battered metal cup. He set them down beside her without ceremony. "Eat," he said, not unkindly. "Starving yourself won't improve your situation." Sarah glanced at the offering, then back at Max. "What exactly is my situation, Mr. Harlan?" He crouched down to her level, lowering his voice. "That depends on you. I came for the cattle, but I'm starting to think your husband might have left something more valuable behind." "Such as?" "Don't play dumb with me, Mrs. Callahan. Robert was at Argonne when the Germans retreated. There were rumors about what some officers found in their headquarters. Gold, artwork, things that never made it back to official channels." So that was it. Not just revenge, but greed. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. "My husband was a lot of things, Mr. Harlan, but he wasn't a thief." "No? Then how did a captain on Army pay afford a spread like this in prime Montana territory?" "Hard work and sacrifice," Sarah replied. "Something you might not recognize." Max's face hardened. "Your tongue's going to get you in trouble, woman. You've already killed my friend, threatened my life, and stolen my cattle. What more trouble could I be in?" He smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "You have a vivid imagination, I'm sure. Use it." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the barn doors, drawing Max's attention. He stood, moving to where he could see outside through a gap in the wood. "Christ," he muttered. "It's really coming down." Sarah rose and joined him, maintaining a careful distance. The world beyond was a churning maelstrom of white, the snow so thick it obscured everything beyond a few feet from the door. "This isn't an ordinary storm," she said quietly. "It's a Montana blizzard. They can last for days, bury whole houses, freeze cattle where they stand." Max shot her a suspicious look. "Trying to frighten me again?" "Just stating facts. By morning the pass will be completely blocked. You won't be able to move the cattle, or yourselves, until it clears." "And how long will that be?" Sarah shrugged. "Days, maybe a week. Do you have provisions for that long?" Uncertainty flickered across Max's face. He glanced back at his men, calculating. "We have enough," he said, but there was a new tension in his voice. "For 5 men, maybe," Sarah conceded. "But what about the cattle? There's only enough hay in this barn for a day or two. After that, they'll start dying. Not much of a theft if all you're taking is carcasses." Max studied her face, trying to read her. "What are you suggesting?" "Let me guide you through the mountains to Silver Creek. There's a pass that stays clear even in the worst weather, if you know where to find it." "And you do?" "I've lived here all my adult life. I know these mountains better than anyone." It wasn't strictly true, but it was close enough. "We could make it to Silver Creek before the worst of the storm hits if we leave at first light." "And why would you help us steal your own cattle?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Because I'm a survivor, Mr. Harlan. I can always rebuild my herd. I can't rebuild my life if you kill me." Max laughed, genuinely amused. "You're something else, Mrs. Callahan. You actually expect me to believe you'd just help us waltz away with your livelihood?" "I expect you to make a rational decision. Stay here and likely die, or let me guide you to safety." He considered her for a long moment, calculating risks and rewards. "And what's to stop you from leading us into some trap, or running off the first chance you get? You'll have guns and my cattle. I'll have my life. It's a fair exchange from where I'm standing." The wind screamed around the barn, punctuating her words with nature's fury. Max turned to look outside again, at the relentless white death piling up against the doors. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Sarah nodded, neither relieved nor disappointed. It was simply the first move in what would be a dangerous game. Later, as the men bedded down for the night, Max called Jimmy and Vern to join him by the fire. They spoke in low voices, casting occasional glances in Sarah's direction. She pretended not to notice, closing her eyes as if trying to sleep in her uncomfortable position against the wall. "Know these mountains better than we do," Max was saying. "Could be useful. Could be a trap," Vern countered. "Woman's got steel in her spine. Wouldn't put it past her." "What choice do we have?" Jimmy asked pragmatically. We're burning through supplies faster than expected. The cattle won't survive a week in this barn, and they're worthless to us dead." "So we take her offer," Max decided, "but we keep her close. One wrong move, one hint of treachery, and she joins her husband." "What about the gold?" Vern asked. "That's the beauty of it," Max replied. "She'll lead us right to it. Woman like that, with her back against the wall, trying to save her own skin, she'll take us the safest route, straight past wherever Callahan hid his stash." Jimmy adjusted his spectacles. "You're assuming it exists at all?" "Oh, it exists," Max said with certainty. "I knew Robert Callahan. The man was sanctimonious as they come in public, but he had angles, always angles." Sarah listened, learning, planning. Let them believe what they wanted. Let them underestimate her. It would be their undoing. Morning came with no cessation in the storm. If anything, it had intensified. The barn was freezing now, the fire reduced to embers that gave little heat. The cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath creating a fog that hung in the air. Max approached Sarah as she stood looking out at the white void beyond the barn doors. "We'll take your offer," he said without preamble. "You guide us to Silver Creek. We let you walk away once we're there." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "We should leave within the hour. It will take all day to reach the pass, and we want to be through it before dark." "How far to Silver Creek?" 2 days in this weather, if we push hard." Max frowned. "That long? The direct route is impassable now. We'll have to go around through the northern valleys." This was the first test. The northern route was longer, more arduous, but also more protected from the worst of the storm. It would buy her time. Time for the weather to worsen, time for Max and his men to weaken, time for opportunity to present itself. "Fine," Max agreed after a moment's consideration. "Get whatever you need. We leave in 30 minutes. As he walked away, Sarah allowed herself a small, grim smile. The first piece was in place. She moved around the barn, gathering what supplies she could: a length of rope, a worn blanket, a small knife hidden in the tack room that the men had overlooked. She worked methodically, her movements deliberate, never betraying the tension coiled within her. As she passed near where Turner was saddling his horse, he spoke in a low voice, not looking at her. "I know who you are," he murmured. "Your husband was a good man." Sarah paused, surprised. "You knew Robert?" Turner nodded slightly. "I served under him at Argonne. Private Cole Turner, ma'am. He saved my life." Before she could respond, Max's voice boomed across the barn. "Time to move out. Get those cattle together." Sarah filed the information away. Another piece on the board. Cole Turner, a possible ally or just another complication. Either way, knowledge was power, and she would need every advantage in the days to come. The men worked quickly, preparing the cattle for the journey. 20 prime beef cattle, each worth a small fortune in the right market. Sarah's entire livelihood, the culmination of years of back-breaking work. Max approached her again as they prepared to leave. "One last thing, Mrs. Callahan," he said, producing her husband's revolver and holding it out to her butt first. "You'll need this. There are wolves in these mountains, I hear." Sarah took the gun with a steady hand, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not trust, but a test. If she turned it on them now, she would die instantly. If she refused it, she would appear weak or suspicious. "There are predators of all kinds in these mountains, Mr. Harlan," she replied, tucking the weapon into her coat. "Best to be prepared." Max smiled thinly. "Indeed. After you, guide." Sarah stepped out into the blinding white of the storm, feeling the full fury of the wind for the first time. It cut through her clothing like knives, stealing her breath. But she didn't falter. Behind her, Max and his men urged the reluctant cattle forward, into the howling wasteland that had once been familiar terrain. She oriented herself quickly, identifying landmarks barely visible through the swirling snow. North toward the mountains, toward terrain she knew intimately, terrain that had already claimed one life dear to her. If fortune favored her, it would claim 5 more before the storm was done. The procession moved slowly through the deepening snow, Sarah in the lead, followed by Max and Jimmy, then Lyle and Vern driving the cattle, with Cole bringing up the rear. The Ford Model T that the gang had apparently stolen in their last raid was proving more hindrance than help. Its narrow wheels sinking into the snow, the engine protesting the cold with stuttering coughs. 2 hours into their journey, they had covered less than 3 miles. The cattle balked at the driving snow, and twice a small group had tried to break away, requiring Cole and Vern to ride them down and herd them back. The temperature continued to drop, the wind cutting through layers of clothing as if they were paper. Sarah maintained a steady pace, leading them north toward the foothills. She chose her path carefully, not so difficult that Max would become suspicious, but challenging enough to tax both men and beasts. Every delay, every obstacle served her purpose. Max rode up beside her, his face reddened by the cold, ice forming in his mustache. "We're making poor time," he shouted over the wind. "The storm's worse than I expected," Sarah called back, a half-truth that served her purpose. "We need to reach the tree line. It'll be more sheltered there." Max squinted at the distant smudge of pines barely visible through the whiteout. How much farther? Another hour, maybe 2. He cursed, then nodded reluctantly. "Keep moving. But remember, Mrs. Callahan, if this is some ploy to wear us down or lose us in the storm, you'll be the first to freeze." Sarah didn't bother responding. Let him threaten. Words were wind, and there was plenty of that already. They pressed on, the world narrowing to the immediate struggle, placing one foot after another, leaning into the wind, keeping the barely visible shapes of cattle and riders in sight. Sarah felt the cold seeping into her bones despite her layers, but she embraced it. Cold sharpened the mind, and she needed every faculty at peak performance. By mid-afternoon, they reached the tree line. The pines offered some shelter from the relentless wind, though snow still filtered through the branches, accumulating in drifts between the trees. Sarah called a halt in a relatively protected clearing. "We need to rest the cattle," she explained to Max. "They're not used to traveling in these conditions. Push them too hard, and they'll collapse." Max looked as if he wanted to argue, but a glance at the exhausted animals changed his mind. 1 hour, he conceded. No more. As the men dismounted and gathered to warm themselves, Sarah moved among the cattle, checking their condition. Most were holding up well enough, though their coats were crusted with ice and snow. 2 were showing signs of distress, labored breathing, trembling legs. Cole appeared beside her as she examined one of the struggling animals. "They won't make it to Silver Creek," he said quietly. "Not all of them," Sarah nodded, keeping her voice low. "I know." Cole glanced back at the others, then spoke urgently. "Mrs. Callahan, I need to tell you, I'm not with them, not really. Max holds markers on me, gambling debts. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice, Mr. Turner," Sarah replied, her tone neutral. "My husband taught me that." He was right. Cole's young face was etched with shame. Captain Callahan was a good man. When I heard what happened to him, the influenza after everything he survived in the war, it didn't seem fair. Sarah continued her examination of the cattle, giving no indication of the conversation to anyone watching. "Life rarely is, Mr. Turner. Did you know my husband well?" "Well enough. I was just a private, but he knew every man in his company by name, treated us all like we mattered." Cole hesitated. "That's why I can't let them hurt you. The captain would never forgive me." Sarah finally looked at him directly, assessing. Cole Turner couldn't be more than 26, with the haunted eyes of a man who had seen too much, too young. The war had that effect, aged some parts of a man while stunting others. "What do you propose?" she asked. "Tonight, when they sleep, I'll create a distraction. You take a horse and ride for help. A simple plan. Too simple. And the cattle?" Cole blinked as if surprised by her priorities. "They're just cattle, ma'am. They're my livelihood. Everything I have left." Sarah shook her head. "Besides, Max would track us down before we got 5 miles in this snow." "Then what? Everything all right over there?" Max called, his voice carrying across the clearing. Sarah straightened. "Fine. This one's favoring its left hind leg, nothing serious. Max beckoned imperiously. Both of you, get over here, now. Cole shot her a worried glance as they moved to join the others. Sarah kept her face impassive, betraying nothing. The men had managed to start a small fire in the shelter of a fallen log. It provided meager warmth but improved morale, a psychological comfort more than a physical one. "What were you two discussing so intently?" Max demanded as they approached. "The condition of the cattle," Sarah replied evenly. "Two are showing signs of fatigue." "Your concern for the merchandise is touching," Max sneered. He turned to Cole. "And you, Turner? Suddenly an expert on cattle?" Cole flushed. "Just offering to help is all." "How chivalrous." Max's eyes narrowed. "You seem mighty concerned about Mrs. Callahan's welfare. Something I should know?" "Leave the kid alone, Max," Jimmy interjected, glancing up from where he was consulting a tattered map. "He's just trying to be useful, unlike some." This with a pointed look at Lyle, who was huddled miserably by the fire, contributing nothing. Max ignored him, focusing on Cole. "You knew her husband, didn't you?" "That's what this is about." Cole swallowed visibly, but held his ground. "I served under Captain Callahan, yes. He was a good officer." "A good officer," Max repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Tell me, did your good officer happen to mention what became of the contents of a certain German officer's safe, the one at Argonne?" Cole looked genuinely confused. "Sir?" "Don't play dumb with me, boy." Max grabbed Cole by the front of his coat, pulling him close. "Callahan and his select few men, including you, were first into that headquarters. There was a fortune in that safe, gold, jewelry, bonds, all of it gone by the time the brass arrived." "I don't know what you're talking about," Cole protested. "There wasn't any treasure? Just papers, military documents?" "Liar!" Max shoved him away with enough force to send him stumbling backward into the snow. "I know what was there. I had a man on the inside." Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. So that was the real reason for Max's vendetta, not just professional rivalry or revenge, but a fortune he believed Robert had stolen. It was almost laughable. Robert, who'd come home from the war with nothing but nightmares and a persistent cough that eventually killed him. Who'd worked himself to exhaustion building their ranch. Who'd died leaving her with nothing but the land and livestock they'd acquired through years of sacrifice. If there had been a fortune, they certainly hadn't benefited from it. Cole scrambled to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward his holstered pistol. Max's gun was already drawn. "Give me a reason, Turner," he said softly. "Just one." "Max, this is pointless," Jimmy cut in, standing. "Even if Turner knows something, killing him won't get it for you." "Shut up, Jimmy." Max kept his gun trained on Cole. "I've waited 2 years to find Callahan's stash. I'm not letting this runt stand in my way." The tension stretched taut as a wire. Sarah could see Cole calculating his chances, poor given Max's experience and readiness. "He doesn't know anything," she said, drawing all eyes to her. "My husband never mentioned any treasure to him." Max swung his gun toward her. "And how would you know that?" "Because if Robert had trusted anyone from his company with such a secret, it would have been his second in command. Lieutenant Warren Hayes." She was improvising now, building on fragments of stories Robert had shared. "Not a private, no matter how loyal." Max's eyes narrowed. "Hayes died in the offensive." "Exactly. Whatever secrets he and Robert shared died with him." Sarah took a calculated risk. "But Robert did mention a German safe to me once, in his fever dreams, near the end." It was a lie, but one Max would want to believe, one that might spare Cole's life and buy her more time. "What did he say?" Max demanded, taking a step toward her. "Not here," Sarah replied, glancing meaningfully at the others. "What you're looking for, it's not something to discuss openly." Max studied her face, trying to detect deceit. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He holstered his gun slowly. "Tonight," he said. "You and I will have a private conversation, Mrs. Callahan." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. One crisis averted, but at what cost? She'd bought time, but also raised expectations she couldn't fulfill. Max turned back to Cole. As for you, you're useful with that Model T, the only one who can keep it running in this cold. That's the only reason you're still breathing. Cole nodded stiffly, relief and apprehension warring on his face. Get it started, Max ordered. We've wasted enough time. As Cole moved toward the automobile, Sarah caught his eye briefly. A warning glance, a small shake of her head. Not now, not yet. He gave the faintest nod in return. Message received. The group prepared to move out again, the brief rest having done little to restore their energy or warm their chilled bodies. The cattle were reluctant to leave the relative shelter of the trees, but Vern and Lyle drove them forward with shouts and occasional gunshots fired into the air. Sarah resumed her position at the head of the procession, leading them deeper into the mountains, toward a pass that would indeed take them to Silver Creek. Eventually. But first, it would take them through some of the most challenging terrain in Montana, where the full fury of the storm would be channeled between the peaks like water through a flume. As they left the shelter of the trees, the wind hit them with renewed violence, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet. The cattle balked, lowing in distress. Behind her, she heard the Model T's engine sputter and die, followed by Cole's frustrated cursing as he fought to restart it. "Leave it!" Max shouted after several failed attempts. "We'll come back for it later." Sarah hid her satisfaction. One more piece of Max's resources eliminated, one step closer to evening the odds. They pressed on into the white void, a ragged line of dark shapes barely visible to one another. Sarah felt the storm's power building around them, the temperature dropping further, the wind finding new strength. She welcomed it. The storm was her ally now, her weapon, her shield. In its chaos lay her opportunity. By nightfall they would be fully committed to a path from which there would be no easy return. And then, as they struggled against the elements, Sarah Callahan would show these men what true survival meant. Let them think her defeated, compliant, a victim leading them to treasure. They would learn, as her husband's enemies had learned in the war, that underestimating a Callahan was a fatal mistake. The storm intensified, shrouding her smile in swirling white. By late afternoon, the world had narrowed to an endless tunnel of white. Sarah led the procession through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous, narrow paths skirting steep drops, rock formations that channeled the wind into knife-like gusts, gullies where the snow had drifted higher than a man's chest. The cattle struggled, their progress slowing to a crawl as they pushed through the deepening snow. Sarah navigated with unerring confidence, despite the near-zero visibility. 20 years in these mountains had etched every contour, every landmark into her memory. Even in the blinding whiteness, she knew exactly where they were, and more importantly, where she was leading them. Max rode just behind her, his face a frozen mask of suspicion and discomfort. The cold had penetrated all their layers now, seeping into bones, slowing movements, dulling reflexes. Exactly as Sarah had planned. "How much farther to this pass?" he shouted over the howling wind, drawing his horse alongside hers. "We won't reach it today," Sarah replied, gesturing at the darkening sky, visible through brief breaks in the snowfall. "We need to find shelter for the night." Max cursed, the sound whipped away by the wind. "You said we'd make the pass by nightfall." "I said we needed to be through it by dark," Sarah corrected calmly. "The storm's worse than expected. Pushing on would be suicide." It was the truth, but also part of her strategy. Delay, exhaust, control the timetable. Max glared at her, ice crusting his eyebrows and mustache. "And I suppose you know somewhere we can shelter nearby?" "There's a natural overhang about a mile ahead. It's not ideal, but it will block the worst of the wind." Jimmy had ridden up to join them, his scholarly face pinched with cold beneath his fogged spectacles. "We should listen to her, Max. The cattle are at their limit and so are the men. Lyle's showing signs of frostbite already." Max looked back at their struggling caravan, Lyle and Vern attempting to keep the cattle moving, Cole bringing up the rear, all of them bent against the relentless wind, snow accumulating on their coats until they resembled moving drifts. "Fine," he conceded grudgingly. "But I'm warning you, Mrs. Callahan, if this shelter doesn't materialize, you'll spend the night tied to a tree in the open." Sarah didn't dignify the threat with a response. She turned her horse and continued forward, picking her way carefully through a field of partially concealed boulders. This section of the journey was genuinely dangerous, a rock field created by an ancient landslide, now treacherous under shifting snow. One misstep could mean a broken leg for horse or human. As she navigated the hazardous terrain, Sarah's mind worked furiously, planning her next moves. The overhang was real, a hollowed-out section of cliff that offered protection from above and one side, with room for the humans but not the cattle. The night would be brutal for the livestock. Some might not survive, a necessary sacrifice in her larger strategy. The cattle grew increasingly reluctant as they entered the boulder field, sensing the danger beneath the snow. One heifer balked completely, refusing to move despite Vern's shouts and threats. The delay rippled backward through the procession, causing the entire group to halt. Sarah watched from atop a large, flat boulder as Vern dismounted to deal with the recalcitrant animal. The sharp crack of his pistol hitting the heifer's skull echoed across the white expanse, followed by the animal's pained bellow. Not a killing blow, just cruelty meant to force compliance. Cole rode forward instantly, his voice carrying on the wind. "Stop it! You'll drive them into a panic." Vern rounded on him, gun still raised. "Mind your business, boy." "The cattle are worth nothing dead," Cole shouted back. "And if they stampede in this terrain, we'll lose half of them." Sarah could see the confrontation escalating, the tension that had been building all day reaching a breaking point. Perfect. Let them fight amongst themselves. Let them waste energy and focus while the cold did its work. But Max intervened before blows could be exchanged, riding back to separate the men. "Enough! We're not shooting any cattle unless I give the order. Vern, get back on your horse. Turner, help move that heifer along." The procession resumed, but the rhythm was broken, the group more disjointed than before. Sarah noted how Vern glared at Cole, how Lyle huddled deeper into his coat, his movements increasingly sluggish. Jimmy alone seemed relatively unaffected, his analytical gaze taking in the deteriorating situation with academic detachment. They reached the overhang just as twilight was fading into true darkness. It appeared suddenly through the swirling snow, a dark gash in the white landscape, the cliff face above it providing a natural roof that extended outward about 15 feet. Not a cave, but deep enough to block the direct force of the wind and snow. "This is it?" Max asked skeptically, eyeing the Spartan shelter. "This is it," Sarah confirmed. "We can build a fire against the back wall. The smoke will escape at the edges." The men dismounted stiffly, their limbs protesting after hours in the saddle. The cattle they herded into a rough semicircle in front of the overhang, where they would have to weather the night with minimal protection. Already they were huddling together, instinctively forming a living barrier against the cold. Inside the shallow shelter, the relative absence of wind was immediately noticeable. The temperature wasn't significantly warmer, but the respite from the constant assault of icy particles felt like a luxury. "Get a fire going," Max ordered Lyle and Vern. "Turner, check the horses. Jimmy, take stock of our provisions." The men moved to their tasks with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Cole led the horses into the semi-protected area at one end of the overhang, while Lyle and Vern searched for what dry wood they could find nearby. Sarah took advantage of the momentary chaos to survey their position. The overhang was situated halfway up a gentle slope, providing a view down into the valley they had traversed. In the fading light, she could just make out their tracks already being erased by fresh snow. By morning, there would be no sign of their passage. Ahead of them, invisible in the darkness and swirling white, lay the narrow cut between two ridges that would eventually lead to the mountain pass proper. It was there in that natural funnel that the storm would reach its full fury. There, where the wind would be channeled and intensified, where snowdrifts could accumulate to depths of 6 feet or more in a matter of hours. There, where Sarah planned to spring her trap. "Admiring your handiwork?" Jimmy's voice came from beside her, making her start slightly. He had approached silently, a skill she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I don't know what you mean," Sarah replied neutrally. Jimmy smiled thinly, his spectacles reflecting the last of the twilight. "I think you do. This route, the abandoned vehicle, the increasingly exhausted cattle. Very methodical." Sarah turned to face him fully, keeping her expression carefully blank. "I'm doing exactly what I was coerced to do, leading you to Silver Creek by the only passable route in this weather." "Of course you are." Jimmy's tone made it clear he didn't believe her. "But you're also a woman with nothing left to lose, whose husband was—" He paused, selecting his words with precision, intimately familiar with strategic thinking. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through Sarah. This man was dangerous, not in the brutal, obvious way that Max was, but in his perception, his intellect. "My husband taught me many things," she said carefully, "survival chief among them." "I'm sure he did." Jimmy glanced back at the men struggling to start a fire with damp wood. "For what it's worth, I was at Argonne too, not as a soldier, as a correspondent. I saw what happened there, the official version and the reality." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her face impassive. "And which version did you report?" "Neither. Some stories aren't meant to be told." Jimmy removed his spectacles, cleaning them methodically with a handkerchief despite the futility of the gesture in the falling snow. "Your husband was a complex man, Mrs. Callahan. Hero to some, something else to others. All men contain multitudes, Mr. Rollins. Even you, I suspect." A ghost of a smile touched Jimmy's lips. "Indeed." He replaced his spectacles. "A word of advice. Max won't be deterred. Whatever you're planning, he'll see it coming. He always does." "I'm not planning anything beyond getting us all to Silver Creek alive," Sarah insisted. "As you say." Jimmy inclined his head slightly. "I'll leave you to your navigation planning." He walked away, returning to where the others had finally kindled a small, smoky fire against the back wall of the overhang. Sarah watched him go, a new wariness in her assessment. She had identified Max as the primary threat, his brutality, his vendetta against Robert. But perhaps that had been a mistake. Jimmy Rollins, with his keen observations and unknown motives, might pose the greater danger. The night deepened, the temperature plummeting further. The men huddled around their meager fire, passing a bottle of whiskey for warmth as much as comfort. Sarah sat apart, declining both the bottle and the fire's dubious heat. Cold sharpened her senses, kept her alert. She would need every advantage in the hours to come. Max beckoned her over around midnight, his eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's. "Time for that private conversation, Mrs. Callahan." Sarah rose and approached, aware of the others watching with varying degrees of interest. Only Cole seemed genuinely concerned, his young face tense with worry. Max led her to the edge of the overhang, just out of earshot of the others, but still within sight. The storm raged beyond their shelter, a wall of white fury that reduced visibility to arm's length. "Now," Max said, turning to face her, "tell me what your husband said about Argonne, about the safe." Sarah had prepared for this, crafting a story with just enough truth to be believable, just enough mystery to maintain Max's interest. "It wasn't in his right mind," she began, her voice pitched low. The fever from the influenza was high. He was delirious, talking about the war, about things he'd never mentioned before. Max's eyes narrowed with impatience. "Get to the point." "He mentioned a German officer, an Oberst, I think he called him. Said the man had a fortune hidden in his headquarters. Gold coins, jewelry, bearer bonds." "I know all that," Max snapped. "What I don't know is where it went." Sarah hesitated, as if reluctant to continue. "Robert said he and Lieutenant Hayes moved it before the brass arrived. Said it wasn't safe there, that scavengers would take it." She looked directly into Max's eyes. "He was looking at me when he said scavengers, but I don't think he recognized me. I think he was seeing someone from the war." Max's breathing had quickened, his entire focus on her words. Where did they move it? That's just it. He never said explicitly. He kept mumbling about the Shepherd's Watch and stone sentinels. Nothing that made sense to me. The Shepherd's Watch, Max repeated, his brow furrowing. Could be a location, a landmark. Sarah shrugged helplessly. Maybe, or maybe it was just the fever talking. He died the next day without ever becoming lucid again. Max studied her face intently, looking for deception. If you're lying to me, what would be the point? Sarah countered. I've told you everything I know. If there was a fortune, don't you think I'd have found it in the 2 years since his death? Do you think I'd be struggling to keep a cattle ranch afloat if I had that kind of money? It was the most convincing argument she could make, and she could see it landing. Max glanced back at the ranch house, mentally cataloging its modest furnishings, the workaday cattle, the absence of luxury. The Shepherd's Watch, he muttered again. Stone sentinels. It has to mean something. He grabbed her arm suddenly, fingers digging in painfully. Think, woman. Did Robert ever mention those phrases before? Any place near here that could match those descriptions? Sarah allowed a look of concentration to cross her face, as if searching her memory. There's an old mine in these mountains, long abandoned. The entrance has 2 tall rocks on either side that some say look like men standing guard. Locals call them the Sentinels. It was true, such a place existed, though it was nowhere near their current route. Another misdirection, another thread for Max to chase while her real plan unfolded. Where is this mine? Max demanded. On the other side of Silver Creek, about a day's ride past the town. Max's grip tightened further. You're sure? If this is another delay tactic, check your map, Sarah suggested calmly, despite the pain in her arm. It should be marked. Most locals know of it, though few venture there anymore. There was a collapse about 10 years back, killed 3 men. Max released her abruptly, turning to look out at the storm as if he could somehow see through the swirling white to the prize he sought. Sarah resisted the urge to rub her arm where his fingers had left marks. We continue to Silver Creek at first light, he decided. No more delays, no more excuses. The pass, Sarah started to object. We'll get through it, Max cut her off, or you won't live to see another day. Clear? Sarah nodded, her face betraying nothing of the calculations continuing in her mind. Clear. Max stalked back to the fire, leaving her at the edge of the overhang. Sarah watched him go, then turned to look out into the storm. It showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was intensifying, just as she had anticipated. The first part of her plan was proceeding perfectly. The second would be far more dangerous. Dawn arrived not as brightening sky, but as a subtle shift from black to gray within their relentless white prison. The storm had not abated. If anything, it had strengthened overnight, the wind howling with renewed fury, driving needles of ice that stung exposed skin like wasps. Sarah was already awake, had been for hours, watching the men sleep fitfully around the dying embers of their fire. She had dozed briefly, trained by years of ranch work and motherhood to snatch rest when possible, to wake alert at the slightest change in her surroundings. The cattle had survived the night, though they looked miserable, ice encrusting their hides, heads lowered against the wind, bodies pressed together for warmth. 2 of the weaker animals were showing signs of severe distress, their breathing labored, legs trembling with exhaustion. Max emerged from his blankets, immediately alert as he surveyed the unchanged conditions. His gaze found Sarah, narrowed with suspicion at her wakeful state. Storm's not letting up, he observed unnecessarily. No, Sarah agreed. It's developed into a genuine blizzard. We should wait it out. Not an option. Max kicked Lyle's foot, then Vern's. Up. We're moving out. The men stirred reluctantly, their movements stiff with cold and discomfort. Jimmy sat up smoothly, as if he'd been merely resting rather than sleeping, his gaze sharp behind frost-rimed spectacles. Cole was already tending to the horses, his young face drawn with exhaustion, but determined. Max, be reasonable, Jimmy said, his tone measured as always. Visibility is near zero. We'll lose cattle, maybe men." "I don't recall asking your opinion," Max snapped. He turned to Sarah. "The pass. How far?" 3 hours in good conditions," Sarah replied honestly. "In this? Could be double that." Max considered, calculating risks against his driving impatience. "We move," he decided. "Now, get the cattle ready." No one looked happy with the decision, but no one argued further. They had all seen what happened to those who challenged Max's authority. Breakfast was a hasty, joyless affair. Hardtack and jerky washed down with melted snow, the men eating mechanically, fuel for the ordeal ahead rather than sustenance to be enjoyed. Sarah declined food again, preferring clarity to comfort. As they prepared to depart, Cole approached her under the pretense of checking her horse's saddle. "This is madness," he murmured, his back to the others. "The pass will be nearly impassable in these conditions." "I know," Sarah replied quietly. "Stay close to the cattle. When the time comes, head for the western ridge. There's a sheltered draw about 100 yards up." Cole's eyes widened slightly, but he gave no other indication of surprise. "The others will have to fend for themselves." Sarah checked that no one was watching, then slipped something from her pocket into Cole's hand, the small knife she'd retrieved from the tack room before leaving the ranch. "Just in case." Cole concealed the weapon quickly, nodding almost imperceptibly. No more needed to be said. He understood what was coming. They set out into the maelstrom, Sarah again taking the lead. The going was even more difficult than the previous day, the accumulated snow now reaching the horses' knees in places, forcing them to high-step laboriously forward. The cattle balked repeatedly, requiring constant attention from Vern and Lyle to keep them moving. Sarah led them steadily upward toward the narrowing passage between two ridges that would eventually open onto the high mountain pass. The wind intensified as they entered the natural funnel, the surrounding terrain channeling it into powerful gusts that threatened to knock riders from their saddles. 2 hours into their journey, disaster struck. One of the weakened cattle, pushed beyond endurance, collapsed in the deep snow. The animals behind it balked, creating a chain reaction of confusion. Vern, already in a foul mood from the relentless cold, rode forward and began beating the fallen animal with the butt of his rifle, shouting obscenities that were whipped away by the wind almost before they left his mouth. The stricken cow struggled to rise, legs flailing uselessly in the deep snow. Blood appeared on its hide where Vern's rifle struck again and again. "Stop it!" Cole shouted, pushing his horse forward. "You're making it worse." Vern rounded on him, rifle still raised. "Mind your own business, boy." "The cattle are our business," Cole shot back. "All of ours, and you're going to drive them into a panic." Vern's face contorted with rage. "I've had enough of your sanctimonious crap, Turner." He swung the rifle toward Cole, not to strike, but to aim. Max's voice cut through the confrontation like a bullwhip. "Vern, stand down!" Vern hesitated, the rifle still pointed at Cole. For a moment it seemed he might defy even Max's direct order, pushed past reason by cold, exhaustion, and frustration. "I said stand down," Max repeated, his own gun now drawn and pointed at Vern. Slowly Vern lowered his rifle, his face a mask of resentment. "He's been undermining us from the start, Max. Him and the woman both." "I don't care if he's been dancing with the devil," Max replied coldly. "We need every man and we need these cattle moved. You want to shoot someone? Do it after we reach Silver Creek." The fallen cow had managed to regain its feet during the confrontation, swaying unsteadily but alive. The procession resumed, but the harmony, such as it was, had been irrevocably broken. The group was fracturing, just as Sarah had anticipated. An hour later, they reached the entrance to the pass proper, a narrow defile between towering rock faces, the ground rising steeply. Here the wind reached its peak intensity, funneled between the cliffs into a howling banshee that tore at clothing and froze exposed skin almost instantly. "We need to turn back," Jimmy shouted, barely audible over the tempest. "This is suicide." For once, Max seemed to waver. The pass before them was a nightmare of white fury, visibility reduced to mere feet. The cattle were balking again, refusing to enter the narrow passage despite the men's urging. Sarah observed the indecision on Max's face, the first crack in his iron determination. This was the moment she had been waiting for, when doubt and fear began to erode confidence, when survival instinct warred with greed and pride. "There's another way," she called out, drawing all eyes to her. "It's longer, but safer. A secondary trail that skirts the western ridge." Max regarded her with deep suspicion. "You never mentioned this before." "It adds half a day to the journey," Sarah explained. "I didn't think you'd consider it. And now you think I will?" Sarah gestured at the howling death trap of the pass. "Now I think you have no choice, not if you want to reach Silver Creek alive." Max considered, visibly torn between suspicion of Sarah's motives and the undeniable reality of the conditions before them. Finally, survival won out. "Show me this other trail," he ordered. Sarah turned her horse, leading them away from the pass entrance and along the base of the western ridge. The going was slightly easier here, the ridge providing some shelter from the direct force of the wind. After 20 minutes of difficult travel, she halted before a narrow track that wound upward along the ridge face. It was barely visible through the swirling snow, little more than a suggestion of a path. "This is it?" Max asked incredulously. "It widens once you're on it," Sarah assured him. "It was originally a game trail used by mountain goats. The miners improved it as an emergency route when the main pass was blocked." It was another lie, though not entirely. Such a trail did exist, but it didn't connect to Silver Creek. Instead, it led to a dead end, a box canyon with sheer walls and no exit save the way they would enter. Another trap within the larger trap of the storm. "You first," Max said, gesturing with his gun. "And remember, Mrs. Callahan, one false move, one sign of treachery, and you die first." Sarah nodded calmly, urging her horse onto the narrow trail. It was treacherous going, the path barely wide enough for a single file of horses, with a sharp drop-off to one side partially obscured by drifting snow. Behind her, she could hear the men struggling to drive the reluctant cattle onto the path. The animals' instincts were sound. They sensed the danger even if the humans did not. "Leave the weakest ones," she heard Max order. "We can't afford to wait." There were sounds of struggle, then 3 gunshots in rapid succession. Sarah didn't need to look back to know that the weakest cattle had been culled, sacrificed to speed the others along. The procession moved slowly up the winding path, visibility decreasing further as they ascended into clouds that shrouded the upper reaches of the ridge. Sarah led them steadily upward, each step taking them deeper into her trap. After an hour of grueling ascent, they reached a relatively flat section where the trail widened slightly, offering a brief respite from the narrow, exposed path. Sarah called a halt, ostensibly to rest the animals. Max rode up beside her, his face a frozen mask of suspicion and determination. "How much farther to where this trail rejoins the main route?" "Another hour, maybe 2 in these conditions," Sarah replied, adding just enough uncertainty to be believable. "There's a landmark ahead, a stone outcropping shaped like a wolf's head. We turn east there." Max grunted, scanning the white void ahead as if he could force it to reveal its secrets through sheer will. "This had better not be another delay tactic, Mrs. Callahan." "We'll reach Silver Creek," Sarah assured him, her voice even. "One way or another." Something in her tone made Max look at her sharply, but whatever he might have said was interrupted by a shout from the rear of their column. "Cattle breaking!" Lyle's voice, high with panic. "They're running back down the trail." Chaos erupted. Several of the cattle, perhaps panicked by the unfamiliar terrain or driven by some animal instinct for self-preservation, had turned and were attempting to push past the riders behind them, back toward the relative safety of the lower ground. On the narrow trail it was a recipe for disaster. Horses reared in confusion, men shouted contradictory orders, and the remaining cattle began to respond to the panic of their herd mates, threatening a full-scale stampede in a place where such a thing would mean certain death for many. Sarah watched the unfolding pandemonium with outward concern and inner satisfaction. Another piece of her plan falling into place, not through her direct action, but through the natural consequences of the situation she had engineered. "Do something!" Max bellowed at her. "You know these animals." Sarah slid from her saddle immediately. "Get the men up here, away from the main herd," she instructed, taking charge naturally. "Cattle won't charge uphill if they can avoid it. We need to clear the path behind them, give them somewhere to go." Max hesitated only briefly before shouting orders to his men. "Vern, Lyle, get up here. Leave the cattle. Jimmy, Turner, move it." The men responded with varying degrees of alacrity, urging their mounts upward along the trail, abandoning any pretense of controlling the increasingly agitated herd. Sarah's prediction proved accurate. Once the humans and horses were no longer blocking their retreat, the cattle chose the path of least resistance, turning back down the trail in a disorganized but determined exodus. Within minutes, half their stolen herd was disappearing back down the mountainside, lost to the swirling white. "God damn it!" Max raged, watching his prize literally running away. "This is your fault, Callahan. You and your cursed safe route." "Would you rather be caught in a stampede on a 3-foot-wide trail with a 100-foot drop?" Sarah countered calmly. "We still have half the herd, more than enough to make a profit in Silver Creek." Before Max could respond, Jimmy cut in, his voice strained but rational. "She's right, Max. We're lucky no one went over the edge. We need to move forward, not back. Those cattle are gone." Max's face contorted with barely suppressed fury, but he recognized the truth in Jimmy's words. "Move out," he ordered curtly. "And Mrs. Callahan, you'd better pray we find that wolf's head rock soon, or I might decide we don't need a guide after all." Sarah remounted her horse and resumed leading the diminished party upward along the treacherous path. Behind her, the atmosphere had changed palpably. Frustration and anger now added to the fear and exhaustion that had been building for days. Perfect conditions for her next move. As they continued their ascent, the wind began to shift, swirling in unpredictable patterns that sometimes gave brief glimpses of the terrain ahead through the endless white. During one such moment of relative clarity, Vern suddenly called out, "There! Is that the rock you mentioned?" He was pointing to a dark shape looming through the snow, a jagged outcropping that, with some imagination, might resemble a wolf's head in profile. Sarah assessed their position carefully. They were approaching the entrance to the box canyon, the dead end that would trap them completely. But not quite yet. She needed them fully committed, with no easy retreat possible. "No," she replied with convincing certainty. "That's not it. Similar formation, but the real landmark is larger, more distinct. Easy to mistake in this weather." Vern's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You seem mighty sure for someone who can barely see 10 feet ahead." "I've traveled this route many times, Mr. Vern, in all weather conditions. I know these mountains like I know my own face." "So you say," Vern muttered, but he subsided, falling back into position behind Max. They pressed on, the trail narrowing again as it curved around a shoulder of the ridge. Here the drop-off to their right was truly precipitous. Hundreds of feet of empty air, obscured by swirling snow, but no less deadly for being invisible. Sarah led them steadily forward, aware that they were minutes away from the canyon entrance. Once inside, the high walls would provide some shelter from the wind, making the conditions marginally more bearable. That temporary relief would make the realization of their predicament all the more devastating when it came. Behind her, she could sense Cole moving closer, positioning himself strategically. He had understood her earlier instructions, was preparing for whatever came next, a good soldier, following orders without unnecessary questions. Robert would have approved. The thought of her husband brought the familiar mix of grief and resolve. What she was doing, leading these men to their likely deaths, was not something the Robert she had married would have condoned. But the Robert who returned from war, who had seen the darkest capabilities of humanity, that Robert might have understood, might even have done the same. As they rounded the final bend before the canyon entrance, a sudden break in the driving snow revealed their destination in stark clarity. A wide, flat space enclosed by sheer rock walls on three sides, the only entrance, the narrow trail they were currently traversing. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought her plan had been exposed too soon. But then the snow closed in again, obscuring the revealing vista, and none of the men behind her had noticed anything amiss. "Almost there," she called back, infusing her voice with encouraging relief. "Just around this bend." Max urged his horse forward until he was alongside her. "Better be," he growled. "My patience is at its end, Mrs. Callahan." Sarah merely nodded, leading them around the final curve and into the relative shelter of the box canyon. As expected, the wind diminished immediately, the high walls blocking its full fury. Visibility improved slightly, though snow still fell heavily. "Where's the continuation of the trail?" Max demanded, scanning the canyon walls. "You said we turn east here." "Further in," Sarah replied smoothly. "The path cuts across the canyon floor, then ascends the eastern wall. See those darker rocks? That's where it begins." She pointed to a shadowy area at the far end of the canyon, deliberately vague enough that by the time they reached it and found no trail, they would be fully committed with no easy retreat. Max studied the direction she indicated, then nodded curtly. "Move the remaining cattle in here. We'll rest briefly, then continue." The men complied with weary relief, grateful for the respite from the direct assault of the wind. The remaining cattle, about half their original number, were herded into the canyon and allowed to bunch together for warmth. Sarah dismounted, stretching cramped muscles while surveying the canyon critically. It was perfect for her purposes. Isolated, protected enough to make the men drop their guard temporarily, with multiple features she could use to her advantage. High, unstable snow cornices clung to the upper edges of the walls, ready to break free with the right encouragement. Narrow ledges provided potential escape routes for those who knew where to look. She had chosen her battlefield well. As the men tended to the cattle and horses, Jimmy approached her, his analytical gaze taking in the canyon's features with professional assessment. "Interesting choice of shelter, Mrs. Callahan," he commented quietly. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "It serves our needs." "Indeed." Jimmy glanced up at the canyon walls, then back to her. "You know, in the war, I saw many tactical decisions made, some good, some catastrophic. The best strategists always chose their ground carefully." The implication was clear. He suspected something, perhaps everything. "We should continue soon," Sarah replied, deliberately ignoring his insinuation. "The temperature will drop rapidly once night falls." Jimmy smiled thinly. "Of course. Far be it from me to delay our progress." He turned to go, then paused. "One more thing, Mrs. Callahan. When a trap is sprung, it sometimes catches more than its intended prey. Remember that." With that cryptic warning, he walked away, leaving Sarah with the uncomfortable certainty that at least one of her adversaries was not as deceived as she had hoped. The rest period was brief, Max's impatience overriding the men's need for extended recovery. Within 30 minutes, they were preparing to move out again, toward the non-existent trail that Sarah had claimed would lead them eastward. As they readied the cattle and horses, a new sound became audible beneath the constant background of wind and snow. A low rumbling from somewhere above, felt more than heard. Cole was the first to notice, his head tilting upward in alarm. "What's that?" Everyone froze, listening. The rumbling grew louder, more distinct. "Avalanche," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "The storms destabilized the snowpack." Max's head snapped toward her, suspicion flaring. "You led us into an avalanche zone?" "All these mountains are avalanche zones in the right conditions," Sarah replied calmly. "This canyon is safer than most. The walls will direct most of the flow over and past us." It was partially true. The canyon's configuration would indeed channel the main force of any avalanche from the upper slopes past its mouth rather than directly into it. What she didn't mention was how snow could build up within the canyon itself, how a smaller slide inside could be just as deadly as a larger one outside. The rumbling intensified, then faded, leaving behind an eerie silence punctuated only by the soft hiss of falling snow. "False alarm," Vern said, relief evident in his voice. "Just some snow shifting higher up." "This time," Jimmy muttered, adjusting his spectacles as he gazed upward. "We should move on quickly." Max nodded in agreement. "Mount up! We've wasted enough time." As they prepared to continue deeper into the canyon and deeper into Sarah's trap, she caught Cole's eye briefly. A slight nod, a subtle hand gesture. Be ready. The endgame was approaching. Within hours, perhaps minutes, the full fury of her plan would be unleashed. Not just the storm, but everything she had set in motion since the moment these men invaded her home. Sarah mounted her horse calmly, her face betraying nothing of the cold calculation behind it. Let them think her defeated, compliant, a victim leading them to safety. They would learn differently soon enough. Deeper into the box canyon they rode, the walls rising ever higher on three sides, narrowing their world to a white-floored corridor with no visible exit. The cattle moved sluggishly now, conserving energy, their instincts warning them of danger that their human drivers ignored. Sarah led with unwavering confidence, directing them toward the far end of the canyon where she had claimed the eastward trail began. In reality, there was nothing there but sheer rock walls and deep snow, the final confirmation of her trap that would soon become apparent to all. Max rode beside her now, his suspicion a palpable force. "We should have reached this trail of yours by now," he growled, scanning the featureless canyon walls ahead. "It's difficult to judge distance in these conditions," Sarah replied calmly. "Another 10 minutes, perhaps." Max's hand moved to rest meaningfully on his holstered pistol. "For your sake, I hope so." Sarah merely nodded, her face betraying nothing of her inner calculations. Everything was proceeding according to plan, despite Jimmy's suspicions and Max's growing impatience. Soon they would reach the terminus of the canyon. Soon the final confrontation would begin. Behind them, the men and remaining cattle struggled through deepening snow. Lyle had fallen back, his movements increasingly labored, face gray with cold and exhaustion. Vern maintained a sullen vigilance, his anger at the escaped cattle still simmering beneath the surface. Cole positioned himself strategically, neither too close to Sarah nor too distant, ready to move when the moment came. Only Jimmy seemed unchanged by their ordeal, his analytical gaze constantly assessing, calculating, anticipating. He watched Sarah with particular intensity, as if trying to decipher a complex code in her every gesture and decision. They had nearly reached the end of the canyon when Jimmy spurred his horse forward suddenly, drawing alongside Max and Sarah. "This is far enough," he announced, his voice cutting through the muffled silence of the snow-filled space. Max looked at him sharply. "What?" "She's leading us into a trap," Jimmy said, gesturing at the looming wall ahead. "There is no eastern trail. This is a box canyon, a dead end." All movement ceased. 5 pairs of eyes turned to Sarah, who remained impassive, neither confirming nor denying the accusation. "Is this true?" Max demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Why don't you ride ahead and see for yourself?" For a moment, no one moved. Then Max signaled to Vern. "Check it out." Vern urged his horse forward, pushing through the deep snow toward the canyon's terminus. The others watched in tense silence as he approached the shadowy area Sarah had indicated earlier where the supposed trail should begin. Minutes stretched like hours. Vern disappeared briefly behind a small outcropping, then reappeared, turning his horse back toward them. Even from a distance, his body language confirmed Jimmy's accusation. "Nothing there." "Nothing," he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Just solid rock." Max's hand moved with lightning speed, drawing his pistol and pressing it against Sarah's temple in one fluid motion. "Give me one reason not to kill you right now." Sarah didn't flinch. "Because I'm the only one who knows the way out of these mountains alive." "There is no way out. You've led us into a death trap." "There's always a way out, Mr. Harlan, for those who know where to look." Sarah's voice remained calm despite the cold steel against her skin. Kill me, and you condemn yourself and your men to death by exposure." Max's finger tightened on the trigger, his face contorted with rage. For a heartbeat, Sarah thought she had miscalculated, pushed him too far too fast. Then Jimmy's voice cut through the tension. "She's right, Max. Killing her solves nothing. We need her knowledge." "Knowledge?" Max spat. "She's done nothing but lie to us from the start." "Not entirely," Jimmy countered. "She led us away from the main pass, which was indeed impassable. And there is shelter nearby, isn't there, Mrs. Callahan?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in her impassive facade. "What do you mean?" Jimmy smiled thinly. "I did my research before we came to Montana. I know about the old mining operations in these mountains. Most were abandoned after the war, but they left behind infrastructure, including emergency shelters for when miners were caught in storms." He gestured at the canyon walls. "This area was rich in copper. There should be a cabin or shelter within a mile or two of here." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Jimmy had known, perhaps not everything, but enough. Enough to counter her careful planning, to force her hand. "There is a cabin," she admitted finally. "But it's not what you think. At this point, I don't care what it is," Max snarled, keeping the gun pressed to her head. "As long as it has walls and a roof." "Where?" Sarah hesitated, genuinely reluctant now. The cabin had never been part of her original plan. It held too many memories, too much pain. She had intended to spring her trap here in the canyon, using the terrain and weather to her advantage. But Jimmy had outmaneuvered her, forcing a change in strategy. "North side of the canyon," she said at last. "There's a narrow path up to a ledge. The cabin sits back from the edge, partially built into the rock face." Max studied her face, looking for deception. Finding none, he lowered his gun slightly. "Show us, now." Sarah nodded, turning her horse toward the northern wall. She led them to a spot where the vertical rock face was interrupted by a diagonal fissure, a natural ramp leading upward to a narrow ledge about 30 feet above the canyon floor. "There," she pointed. "Single file. The horses can make it, but the cattle will have to stay below." Max signaled to Lyle. "Stay with the herd. The rest of us will check out this cabin." Lyle nodded, too exhausted to argue. He slumped in his saddle, watching as the others dismounted to lead their horses up the precarious path. Sarah went first, her movements sure despite the treacherous footing. Max followed close behind, then Jimmy, Vern, and finally Cole. The path was barely wide enough for a horse, with a sheer drop to one side and solid rock to the other. Fresh snow made it even more dangerous, concealing loose stones and icy patches. Halfway up, Vern's horse balked, whinnying in fear. The animal's rear hoof slipped, sending a cascade of small stones tumbling down the slope. "Steady!" Vern hissed, yanking harshly on the reins. The horse reared slightly, nearly toppling both of them over the edge. Cole moved quickly, grabbing the horse's bridle from above. "Easy," he murmured, his touch gentler than Vern's. "Easy now." The horse calmed, allowing them to continue the ascent. Vern glared at Cole, resentment burning in his eyes, but said nothing. They reached the ledge without further incident. It was wider than it had appeared from below, extending back to where the rock face receded into a shallow cave. Built into this natural alcove, utilizing the rock as its back wall, stood a small log cabin. It was a crude structure, weathered by years of mountain storms, but still solid. A single window faced outward, its glass long gone, covered now by a wooden shutter hanging askew. The door was sturdy, reinforced with iron bands to withstand both weather and potential intruders. Sarah approached it with visible reluctance, her earlier composure cracking further. For the first time since the ordeal began, she looked genuinely unsettled. "What's wrong, Mrs. Callahan?" Jimmy asked, noting her hesitation. "Ghosts in there?" Sarah shot him a sharp glance, but didn't respond. Instead, she pushed open the door, which swung inward with a protesting groan of rusted hinges. The interior was simple, one room about 15 feet square, with the natural rock of the mountainside forming the rear wall. A stone fireplace occupied one corner, A rough-hewn table and chairs, another. A narrow cot stood against one wall, its mattress long since claimed by rodents. Shelves held a few dusty cans and bottles, remnants of supplies left behind by previous occupants. But it was none of these features that captured Sarah's attention. Her gaze was fixed on a small wooden box in the corner farthest from the door, a child's toy chest, incongruous in this utilitarian space. Beside it hung a tiny coat on a peg, sized for a boy of perhaps 5 or 6. Max entered behind her, his eyes sweeping the cabin with tactical assessment. Not much, but it'll do until the storm passes. He noticed the direction of her gaze. "What's that?" Sarah's voice was distant when she answered, as if coming from far away. "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything here concerns me." Max pushed past her, crossing to the toy chest. He flung it open, revealing a few tattered children's books and crudely carved wooden figures. "What is this place? Some kind of family hideout?" Sarah didn't answer, her face a rigid mask that nevertheless failed to completely hide the pain beneath. Jimmy stepped forward, his analytical mind connecting pieces invisible to the others. "This was where it happened, wasn't it?" he asked quietly. "Where your son died." The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples of shock through the confined space. All eyes turned to Sarah, whose composure finally cracked completely. The mask fell away, revealing a grief so raw it seemed fresh rather than years old. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thomas. He was 6. Cole made a small sound of dismay. "Mrs. Callahan, Shut up, Turner," Max cut him off, his attention fully on Sarah now. "How? What happened?" Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the swirling snow, as if seeing through time to another storm, another day. "Robert and I had come up to check some traps. Thomas insisted on coming along. He loved the mountains, even in winter. We didn't expect the storm to hit so suddenly. By the time we reached this cabin, visibility was 0, and the temperature was plummeting." She touched the small coat hanging on the peg, her fingers tracing its worn fabric with terrible tenderness. The fireplace wouldn't draw properly. Smoke filled the cabin. We decided to try for the main trail, thought we could make it to a better shelter. Her voice faltered. "Thomas fell, down a crevasse hidden by snow. Robert tried to reach him, but it was too late." The cabin fell silent. The only sound the moan of the wind outside and the soft crackle of the fire Vern had started in the fireplace. Even Max seemed momentarily subdued by the raw grief evident in Sarah's voice and posture. Jimmy, however, was watching her with a calculating expression that had nothing to do with sympathy. "And yet you've led us here," he observed. "To the one place you swore never to return. Why?" Sarah turned from the window, her face hardening again. "Because you left me no choice." "No," Jimmy shook his head. "You've had choices from the beginning. You could have led us straight to Silver Creek by the main pass before the worst of the storm hit. You could have guided us safely once we were caught in it. Instead, you deliberately led us into danger, sacrificed half your own cattle, and brought us to a place filled with personal trauma." His eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "Why?" Before Sarah could respond, the cabin door burst open. Lyle staggered in, his face blue with cold, snow crusted on his beard and eyebrows. "Cattle are dying," he gasped. 3 already gone. Rest won't last the night if the storm doesn't break." Max cursed viciously. "This is your doing," he snarled at Sarah. "All of it. You've been playing us from the start." Sarah didn't deny it. Her moment of vulnerability had passed, replaced by the calm resolve that had sustained her throughout the ordeal. "You invaded my home," she said quietly. "Killed my friend, stole my livelihood. What did you expect, Mr. Harlan? Gratitude?" Max's hand went to his gun again, but Jimmy stepped between them. "Wait, Max. Think. She's still our best chance of getting out of here alive." "She wants us dead," Max shouted. "Has from the beginning." "Perhaps," Jimmy conceded, "but she also wants to survive. Don't you, Mrs. Callahan?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I've survived worse than this storm, Mr. Rollins." "I believe you have." Jimmy turned to Max. We should secure her, but keep her alive, at least until the storm breaks. Max hesitated, calculating, then nodded curtly. Vern, tie her up. Lyle, bring in what supplies you can from the saddlebags. Turner, get that fire built up properly. The men moved to their tasks. Vern approached Sarah with a length of rope, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She submitted without resistance, allowing him to bind her hands in front of her. As he worked, he leaned close, whispering words meant for her ears alone. When this is over, I'll make sure you beg before you die. Sarah's expression didn't change. Many have tried, she replied softly. None have succeeded. Vern's smile faltered slightly at her lack of fear, but he finished securing her bonds and pushed her roughly toward the cot. Sit there, don't move. Cole worked at the fireplace, stoking the flames higher, casting occasional concerned glances at Sarah. She caught his eye briefly, a subtle shake of her head warning him not to show his allegiance too openly. As the cabin warmed slowly, the men shed their outer layers of clothing, revealing weapons that had been concealed beneath. Extra pistols, knives. In Lyle's case, a sawed-off shotgun. An arsenal speaking to their professional nature as outlaws, not the cattle buyers they had initially claimed to be. Jimmy had removed his snow-crusted spectacles, cleaning them methodically with a handkerchief. Without them, his face looked different, harder, more predatory. He replaced them and approached Sarah, sitting beside her on the cot. "You're an interesting woman, Mrs. Callahan," he said conversationally, as if they were meeting at a social event rather than in the midst of a life-or-death struggle. "Most in your position would be paralyzed by fear or rage. You've been calculating, strategic." He smiled thinly, almost like a soldier. "My husband taught me many things," Sarah replied, her voice neutral. "I'm sure he did. Captain Robert Callahan, decorated officer, respected leader, beloved by his men." Jimmy's voice held an undertone Sarah couldn't quite identify. Not quite sarcasm, but something adjacent to it. "A true American hero." "You speak as if you knew him." "Oh, I did. Better than you might think." Jimmy leaned closer. "You see, I wasn't just any war correspondent. I specialized in, let's call it, the reality behind the heroism, the stories the military preferred not to publicize." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your husband's reputation was carefully constructed, like many reputations during wartime." Jimmy glanced toward the others, ensuring they couldn't overhear. "The incident at Argonne, the one Max is so obsessed with, it wasn't quite as the official records state." "You're lying." "Am I? Did Robert ever tell you exactly what happened there? How the German officers died? Why certain items went missing before the brass arrived?" Jimmy's eyes were cold behind his spectacles. Or did he come home broken and silent, drinking away his nightmares, flinching at loud noises, waking screaming from dreams he refused to describe? Sarah's face had gone pale, her composure cracking again. Robert had indeed returned changed, haunted. He had never spoken of Argonne except in fragments, disjointed pieces that never formed a coherent whole. "What's your point, Mr. Rawlins?" she asked, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "My point is that we all have secrets, Mrs. Callahan. Your husband, you, even me." Jimmy smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "And I think it's time we put all our cards on the table." Before Sarah could respond, Max called Jimmy back to where the others were gathered around the table, examining something Lyle had brought in from the saddlebags, a tattered map, spread out on the rough wooden surface. "If we're stuck here until the storm breaks," Max was saying, "we might as well plan our next move. The mine Mrs. Callahan mentioned, the one with the sentinels, should be marked here somewhere." Jimmy joined them, casting one last significant glance at Sarah. The conversation by the table was hushed, punctuated by occasional gestures at the map and glances in Sarah's direction. Cole approached under the pretense of checking the fire, positioning himself where he could speak to her without being overheard. "What's the plan now?" he murmured, his back to the others. "Wait," Sarah replied softly. "The storm will intensify overnight. By morning, they'll be desperate to leave." "And then?" I'll offer to guide Max and Jimmy to a non-existent shortcut. Separate them from the others. Cole nodded slightly. What about the rest of us? Vern will try to kill you the moment you're alone with him, Sarah warned. He's been looking for an excuse since the beginning. I know. Cole's young face hardened. I can handle Vern. And Lyle? He's finished. Frostbite, exhaustion. He won't last another day in these conditions. Sarah assessed Cole's determination, finding it genuine. When the moment comes, be ready to move quickly. There's a tunnel at the back of the cabin behind that shelf of supplies. It was part of the original mining operation. Leads to a lower level of the mountain. Cole's eyes widened slightly. You never mentioned that. I never intended to use it, Sarah admitted. This place, I swore I'd never return. Understanding dawned on Cole's face. Your son. I'm sorry, Mrs. Callahan. Sarah's expression softened momentarily. Thomas would have been about your age now, she said quietly. Then, as if catching herself in a moment of weakness, she straightened. Check the supplies on that shelf. There should be some old mining equipment, lamps, rope, possibly blasting caps or dynamite. Cole nodded and moved casually toward the shelf, examining its contents with apparent idle curiosity. The others remained focused on the map, their discussion becoming more heated as Max and Jimmy disagreed about the best route once the storm cleared. Night was falling outside, the dim gray of the storm-darkened day giving way to true darkness. The temperature dropped further, the wind finding new fury as it howled around the cabin's exposed corner. Inside, the fire provided inadequate warmth against the deepening cold. Vern approached Sarah again, a tin cup of water in his hand. Drink, he ordered, holding it to her lips. Sarah hesitated, suspicious of his sudden solicitude. It's just water, Vern sneered. Max says you're no good to us dead. She drank cautiously, the water ice-cold and metallic tasting. Vern watched her with a strange intensity, his eyes flickering to her bound hands, to her face, then back to the others. Something on your mind, Mr. Vern? Sarah asked quietly. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know what you're doing. Leading us in circles, waiting for the storm to kill us. If that were true, I'd be risking my own life as well. Maybe you don't care about dying, Vern suggested. Maybe you just want revenge, at any cost. Sarah studied him, seeing beyond the brutish exterior to the cunning beneath. You seem to know a lot about revenge, more than you think. Vern's eyes hardened. Your husband took something from me too, something I can never get back. Before Sarah could question him further, Jimmy called Vern back to the table. He straightened, giving her one last significant look before rejoining the others. The evening wore on, tension building in the confined space like pressure in a sealed container. The men ate sparingly from their dwindling supplies, offering Sarah only hardtack and a small piece of jerky. She accepted without complaint, conserving her strength for what was to come. Cole had discovered several useful items on the shelf, and behind it, an old miner's lamp with some fuel remaining, coils of rope, and most valuably, a small box of dynamite sticks with blasting caps. The explosives were old, possibly unstable, but potentially useful. He had concealed his findings from the others, communicating his success to Sarah with only a slight nod. As the night deepened, the men arranged watches, Lyle first, then Vern, Cole, and finally Max. Jimmy declined to participate, claiming he would be more useful rested than standing guard. No one argued. His intellectual air and scholarly appearance made him seem ill-suited to physical vigilance. Sarah remained on the cot, her bound hands in her lap, apparently resigned to her captivity. In reality, she was watching, listening, planning, noting the deteriorating condition of Lyle, the simmering resentment of Vern, the calculated withdrawal of Jimmy, the growing desperation of Max. The pieces were aligning. Soon she would make her move. Midnight came and went, marked only by the changing of guards from Lyle to Vern. Outside, the storm reached new heights of fury, the wind screaming around the cabin with banshee wails that penetrated even the solid log walls. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting the cabin in shadows punctuated by occasional flares of orange light. Max, Jimmy, and Cole slept, or appeared to, while Lyle had collapsed into a fevered half-consciousness after his watch ended. Vern stood by the window, peering out through a crack in the shutter at the impenetrable darkness beyond. Occasionally he would turn to glance at Sarah, checking that she remained on the cot. What he couldn't see was that she had been slowly working at her bonds throughout the evening, using a sharp edge of the cot's metal frame to fray the rope fibers one by one. Her wrists were raw from the effort, but the ropes were significantly weakened. Vern moved away from the window, approaching the fire to add another piece of wood. As he knelt before the fireplace, his back to Sarah, she seized the opportunity to test her bonds. They gave slightly, not enough to free her hands completely, but enough to confirm they would break with one strong effort when the moment came. Vern turned suddenly, catching her movement. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you doing?" "Trying to get comfortable," Sarah replied calmly. "These ropes are cutting off my circulation." Vern approached, looming over her. "Poor thing," he mocked, his voice pitched low to avoid waking the others. "Maybe I should tighten them instead, so you've got something real to complain about." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "You seem to enjoy causing pain, Mr. Vern. Was that why you joined Max's crew? Or was it the money?" "Neither." Vern crouched before her, bringing his face level with hers. "It was to find Captain Robert Callahan." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise breaking through her composed exterior. "You knew my husband?" "Not personally, but I knew his work." Vern's voice had changed, taking on an intensity that transformed his entire demeanor. "My brother was under his command at Argonne. Private David Vernon. Ring any bells?" The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she could see this was dangerous territory. Robert rarely spoke of individual soldiers. No, he wouldn't have. Not the ones he sacrificed. Vern, or Vernon, his apparent full name, leaned closer. "My brother died in that offensive, not by German bullets, but by friendly fire. Your heroic husband ordered an artillery strike on a position he knew was still occupied by his own men." "That's not true," Sarah protested, though doubt crept in. Robert had never detailed the offensive, had avoided all discussion of it. "My husband would never sacrifice his own men." "Wouldn't he? If it meant capturing a German headquarters intact? If it meant securing a safe full of gold and artifacts before anyone else could claim them?" Vernon's eyes burned with long-nurtured hatred. 15 men died in that barrage, Mrs. Callahan. 15. So your husband could reach that headquarters first and take what wasn't his. Sarah shook her head, unwilling to believe. If that were true, he would have been court-martialed, not decorated. "The Army protects its own, especially officers with influential connections." Vernon's voice dripped with bitterness. "The official story was that communications failed, that Captain Callahan never received the orders to wait for reinforcements. A tragic mistake, they called it. And you believe differently." "I know differently, because my brother survived the initial barrage, long enough to write one last letter." Vernon reached into his inner coat pocket, withdrawing a tattered, blood-stained envelope. "He died in a field hospital 3 days later, but he saw what really happened, saw your husband give the order, knowing his men were still in the target zone." Sarah stared at the letter, her mind racing. Could it be true? Could Robert, her Robert, who had been gentle with their son, who had built their home with his own hands, who had awakened screaming from nightmares he refused to describe, could he have deliberately sacrificed his own men? "I don't believe you," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "Read it yourself." Vernon thrust the letter toward her, then pulled it back with a cruel smile. "Oh, but you can't, can you? Not with your hands tied?" He refolded the letter and returned it to his pocket, standing abruptly. "It doesn't matter if you believe me. Max thinks your husband stole gold. Jimmy thinks he has some grand conspiracy to expose. I just want justice for my brother, and by the time we leave these mountains I'll have it, one way or another." Vernon returned to his post by the window, leaving Sarah in turmoil. His accusations had landed like physical blows, undermining certainties she had built her life upon. Could Robert have been capable of such an atrocity? And if so, what else might he have done in the name of duty or self-interest? The fire popped, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. In the brief flare of light, Sarah caught Cole watching her, his eyes open despite his pretense of sleep. He had heard everything, or enough to understand the new dimension to their predicament. Sarah closed her eyes, feigning exhaustion while her mind worked furiously. Vernon's revelation complicated matters, adding personal vendetta to what she had assumed was simple greed and opportunity. If he truly believed Robert responsible for his brother's death, he would not be satisfied merely with the cattle or any mythical treasure. He wanted blood, her blood, as the only remaining Callahan. The night crawled forward, marked by the changing of guards from Vernon to Cole. As they passed each other, Vernon shoved Cole roughly with his shoulder, a petty display of dominance that Cole wisely did not challenge. Once Vernon had settled on his bedroll near the fire, Cole moved to check on Sarah, crouching beside the cot. "Don't believe him," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. "I served under the captain. He would never sacrifice his own men." Sarah searched his young face, looking for any hint of deception or uncertainty. "You were at Argonne?" "Yes, with the forward company. The captain saved as many of us as he could." Cole glanced toward Vernon's sleeping form. What happened was a genuine communication failure. German artillery had knocked out our field telephone lines. The captain tried to halt the barrage when he realized we hadn't cleared the zone, but the orders didn't get through in time. Sarah wanted desperately to believe him. "How can you be sure?" "Because I was there, Mrs. Callahan. I saw the captain's face when he realized what was happening, saw him try to reach as many men as possible before the shells hit." Cole's voice caught slightly. "He pulled me into a shell hole himself, covered me with his own body. I wouldn't be alive if not for him." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Either Cole was an exceptional liar, or he was telling the truth as he had experienced it. Either way, it offered a counter-narrative to Vernon's accusations, one that aligned more closely with the Robert that Sarah had known and loved. "Thank you," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. Cole nodded, then moved away, resuming his watch position by the window. The cabin fell into silence again, broken only by the storm's continued assault outside and the occasional soft snore from one of the sleeping men. Sarah closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to plan. With Cole confirming what she had always believed about Robert's character, her resolve strengthened. These men, Max with his greed, Vernon with his misdirected vengeance, Jimmy with his cryptic agenda, they were the true threat, not just to her livelihood but to Robert's memory, to the truth of what had happened at Argonne. She would not allow them to leave these mountains with their poisonous narratives intact. Around 3 a.m., a new sound joined the cacophony of the storm, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Cole tensed at the window, his head tilting as he listened. "What is that?" Max's voice came suddenly from the darkness, proving he had not been deeply asleep. "Avalanche," Cole replied tersely. "Somewhere close." Max rose, joining Cole at the window. Jimmy stirred as well, reaching for his spectacles before standing. The rumbling intensified, the cabin trembling slightly as the sound grew louder. Dust filtered down from the ceiling beams, dancing in the firelight. "Should we be concerned?" Jimmy asked, his usual composure slightly cracked. Before Cole could answer, Sarah spoke from the cot. "It depends on where it's coming from and where it's going. If it's on the ridge above us, we need to move immediately." Max turned to her, suspicion evident even in the dim light. "And how would we know that?" "Listen to the sound," Sarah instructed. "If it's growing louder and has a roaring quality, it's coming toward us. If it's more of a bass rumble and relatively constant, it's parallel to our position." They all fell silent, straining to interpret the ominous sound. After tense moments, the rumbling began to fade, diminishing to a distant growl before disappearing entirely. "Parallel," Sarah confirmed, "not an immediate threat." "But?" Jimmy prompted, hearing the reservation in her voice. But it could trigger secondary slides, she explained. The vibrations destabilize other snowpacks. We should be prepared to move quickly if necessary. Vernon had awakened during the commotion, his hand already on his pistol. Lyle alone remained unconscious, his breathing labored, his face sheened with sweat despite the cold. "He doesn't look good," Cole observed, nodding toward Lyle's prostrate form. Max approached, crouching to examine his fallen comrade. "Frostbite's spreading," he noted grimly. "Fever's up too." "He needs a doctor," Cole said. "Well, we don't have one, do we?" Max straightened, his decision already made. He either makes it until the storm breaks, or he doesn't. The callousness of the statement hung in the air, confirming what Sarah had already surmised about Max's leadership style. Pragmatic to the point of cruelty, focused solely on his own objectives. "The storm might last for days," she pointed out. "None of us will survive that long without additional supplies." "Then it's fortunate we have you to guide us to safety, isn't it, Mrs. Callahan?" Max's smile was cold. "As soon as there's enough light to see, you're going to lead us out of here, to the real trail this time." "And if I refuse?" Max's hand moved to his gun. "Then I'll shoot Turner first, then Vernon, then myself, because we're all dead anyway without your cooperation. The only question is whether you die knowing you could have saved at least one life." It was a calculated appeal to what he perceived as her weakness, compassion, specifically for Cole, whose connection to Robert made him a potential pressure point. What Max didn't understand was that Sarah's compassion had already been factored into her planning. She had never intended for Cole to die in these mountains. "Once there's light," she agreed, her tone neutral. "Not before." "Attempting to navigate in darkness would be suicide," Max nodded, satisfied with her capitulation. "Until dawn, then." The cabin settled back into uneasy silence, though no one but Lyle attempted to sleep again. The avalanche had served as a stark reminder of their precarious situation, trapped in a fragile shelter on the side of a mountain during the worst blizzard in recent memory, surrounded by unstable snowpacks that could bury them at any moment. Sarah used the time to continue weakening her bonds, working silently and methodically while keeping her eyes half closed, as if dozing. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to penetrate the cabin's single window, the ropes were weakened to the point where one sharp tug would snap them completely. Perfect timing, as Max approached the cot, gesturing for her to stand. "Time to earn your keep, Mrs. Callahan. Get us out of this death trap." Sarah rose obediently, keeping her hands before her to maintain the illusion that she was still securely bound. "We'll need supplies, water, what food remains, the heaviest coats." Max nodded to Vernon. "Get it ready." As Vernon moved to gather the items, Sarah spoke again. "And Mr. Turner should check the mining equipment on that shelf. There might be tools we can use to clear snow from the path." It was a calculated suggestion, directing Cole toward the dynamite they had discovered earlier without arousing suspicion. Max considered briefly, then nodded his agreement. "Do it, Turner, quickly." Cole moved to the shelf, using his body to shield his actions as he secured several sticks of dynamite and blasting caps inside his coat. He returned with a rusted shovel and pickaxe, holding them up for Max's inspection. "Not much, but better than bare hands," he offered. Jimmy had been watching the preparations with analytical detachment, saying little. Now he approached Sarah, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I know what you're planning," he murmured. "It won't work." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm planning to guide you out, as requested." "No, you're planning something more dramatic." Jimmy's eyes flicked to Cole, then back to her. "I saw Turner take the dynamite. I know about the tunnel behind the shelf. I know about the instability of the snowpack on the ridge above." Sarah's expression revealed nothing, but inwardly she cursed Jimmy's perceptiveness. He had indeed been several steps ahead throughout the entire ordeal. "Knowledge is a dangerous thing, Mr. Rollins," she said quietly. "Sometimes it can get you killed." "Or save your life," he countered. "I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Callahan, not in the way you think." Before she could respond, Max called them all to order. "Enough talking. We move out now. Mrs. Callahan leads. I follow. Jimmy, you're next. Then Turner. Vernon, you drag Lyle if he can walk. Leave him if he can't. Vernon didn't look pleased with the assignment, but didn't argue. He roughly hauled Lyle to his feet, the ill man swaying dangerously before finding a tenuous balance. They prepared to exit the cabin into the storm, which had diminished slightly from its peak fury, but remained formidable. Sarah paused at the threshold, turning back to look once more at the small coat still hanging on its peg, the toy chest in the corner. "Goodbye, Thomas," she whispered, too softly for anyone to hear. Then she stepped outside into the white hell that had claimed her son's life, leading the men who had invaded her home into what she intended to be their final reckoning. The storm embraced them immediately, driving snow and ice crystals, stinging exposed skin. Visibility was better than the previous day, but still severely limited, perhaps 50 feet in the clearest moments, dropping to arm's length when the wind gusted. Sarah led them along the narrow ledge, moving away from the path they had used to ascend. Max followed close behind, his gun drawn, making no pretense about the threat should she attempt to flee or mislead them. "Where are we going?" he shouted over the wind. "The way down is back there." "This is a different route," Sarah called back, less exposed to potential slides. It circles around and joins the main path lower down. It was another lie, but a convincing one given their position and limited visibility. In reality, she was leading them toward a section of the ledge she knew to be particularly vulnerable, an area where the snow cornice above overhung significantly, requiring only minimal disturbance to break free. Cole followed, understanding her strategy without needing explanation. He had positioned himself strategically, far enough from Max and Jimmy to have freedom of movement when the moment came, close enough to reach Sarah quickly. Behind them, Vernon struggled with Lyle, whose condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely remain upright. They fell progressively further behind, just as Sarah had anticipated. The ledge narrowed as they proceeded, the drop-off to their right becoming steeper, more precipitous. The wind buffeted them from all sides, threatening to push them over the edge with each powerful gust. Sarah stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. "There!" she shouted. "You can just make out the junction with the main path." Max peered through the swirling snow, squinting to see what she indicated. "Where? I don't see anything." "About 100 yards ahead, where the ledge widens." Sarah moved forward confidently, drawing Max after her. Jimmy hesitated, his analytical mind sensing the trap. "Max, wait!" But Max was already following Sarah, his focus on the non-existent path junction she had claimed to see. Jimmy cursed and hurried to catch up, while Cole maintained his position as rear guard, gradually increasing the distance between himself and the leaders. Vernon and Lyle had fallen so far behind that they were now barely visible through the curtain of snow, exactly as Sarah had planned. She led them to a spot where the ledge curved around a spur of rock, momentarily sheltered from the direct force of the wind. Here she stopped again, turning to face Max. "Just around this corner," she said, gesturing ahead. "The path widens and slopes downward." Max studied her face, suspicion warring with desperate hope for escape from their precarious position. "You first," he decided, gesturing with his gun. Sarah nodded and stepped forward, rounding the rock spur. As soon as she was out of Max's direct line of sight, she braced herself against the rock face and snapped her weakened bonds with one sharp movement. Freeing her hands at last. Max appeared around the corner seconds later, gun still leveled at her. His eyes widened when he saw her unbound hands. "What the—" Sarah didn't give him time to finish. She lunged forward, not at Max but past him, back toward Cole, who had anticipated her move and was already reaching inside his coat for the dynamite. "Now!" she shouted. Cole withdrew a dynamite stick with attached blasting cap, already prepared. In one smooth motion, he struck a match, lit the fuse, and hurled the explosive upward toward the snow cornice overhanging the ledge between them and the cabin. Max whirled, firing his gun instinctively. The bullet went wide, ricocheting off the rock face as Sarah ducked behind a boulder. "Get down," Cole yelled, diving for cover himself. Jimmy alone seemed to comprehend the full implications of what was happening. Instead of seeking shelter, he turned and sprinted back along the ledge toward Vernon and Lyle, trying to escape the blast radius. The explosion, when it came, was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls, momentarily drowning out even the howl of the storm. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groaning sound, the snow cornice above broke free, sending tons of accumulated snow cascading down onto the ledge. The avalanche struck with terrifying force, sweeping across the section of ledge between Cole and the others. Vernon and Lyle disappeared instantly beneath the white deluge. Jimmy, running desperately, was caught at the edge of the slide, knocked sideways and over the precipice with a startled cry that cut off abruptly. Max had taken partial cover behind a rock outcropping, which saved him from being swept away entirely. As the initial slide subsided, he emerged, snow-covered but alive, his face contorted with rage. "Callahan!" he roared, searching for Sarah in the swirling aftermath of the avalanche. "I'll kill you for this!" Sarah had already moved, circling behind the cover of tumbled boulders to approach from Max's blind side. Cole provided distraction, firing his pistol to draw Max's attention in the opposite direction. The plan was working perfectly. The avalanche had isolated Max, eliminating the others just as Sarah had intended. Now it was 1 against 2, with Max unaware of her position and focused on Cole. She crept closer, drawing Robert's service revolver from where she had concealed it beneath her coat after freeing her hands. One clean shot would end it. Revenge for Mr. Jenkins, for her cattle, for the invasion of her home, and the desecration of her son's memory. Max was shouting incoherently now, firing blindly in Cole's direction, his usual calculated control shattered by the sudden reversal of fortune. Snow continued to fall from the damaged cornice above, limiting visibility and muffling sounds. Sarah raised the revolver, aiming carefully at the center of Max's back. Her finger tightened on the trigger. "Not like this, Sarah," a voice said suddenly from behind her. She whirled, gun swinging toward the new threat. To her astonishment, Sheriff William Thompson stood there, snow crusted on his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat, his own revolver held loosely at his side. "Sheriff?" Sarah whispered, disbelieving. "How?" "Followed your trail," Thompson replied tersely. "Been tracking these boys since they hit the Morrison place last week. Lost them in the storm until I saw the explosion." He nodded toward Max. "That Harlan?" Sarah nodded, still struggling to process the sheriff's sudden appearance, the man everyone had believed dead after a shootout with bank robbers the previous spring. "Let me take him in," Thompson said, his voice gentler now. "Don't add murder to what's already happened here." "He killed Mr. Jenkins," Sarah protested, "but stole my cattle. Would have killed me too once I'd served my purpose." "And he'll hang for it," Thompson assured her. "But not like this, not by your hand. Robert wouldn't want that for you." The mention of her husband caused Sarah to falter. Would Robert have wanted this, his wife becoming an executioner? Or would he have wanted justice, proper justice through the law? Before she could decide, a second explosion rocked the mountainside. Not dynamite this time, but a gunshot at close range. Max staggered backward into view, a look of profound surprise on his face, blood blossoming on his chest. Behind him stood Jimmy Rollins, bloody but very much alive, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Consider that payment," Jimmy said to the dying man, "for 15 good men at Argonne." Max collapsed, dead before he hit the snow-covered ground. Jimmy looked up, noticing Sarah and the sheriff for the first time. "Well," he said, his scholarly demeanor incongruously intact despite his battered appearance. "This complicates matters." Sheriff Thompson raised his revolver, training it on Jimmy. "Drop the gun, mister, nice and slow." Jimmy complied, his movements deliberate. "You must be Sheriff Thompson, supposedly deceased, I see." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Thompson replied dryly. "Who are you?" "James Rollins, formerly of the Associated Press. currently collecting material for a book on wartime atrocities and their civilian aftermaths. Jimmy's gaze shifted to Sarah. Your husband features prominently in several chapters, Mrs. Callahan, though perhaps not in the way his admirers might prefer. Cole had approached during this exchange, his own gun trained unwaveringly on Jimmy. He's been working an angle this whole time, Sheriff. Kept talking about the captain, asking questions, making insinuations. Because I was there, Jimmy said simply, at Argonne. Not as a soldier, but as a witness. I saw what Captain Callahan did and what Max Harlan did in return. Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her, too many revelations coming too quickly. What are you saying? I'm saying that the treasures Max was obsessed with, they weren't gold or artifacts. They were documents, evidence of war crimes committed by high-ranking officers on both sides. Jimmy's eyes were intense behind his spectacles. Your husband found them first. Max, as his second-in-command, wanted to use them for blackmail. Robert refused. So Max arranged the artillery strike, Cole interjected, the pieces finally falling into place. Tried to kill the captain and anyone else who knew about the documents. Jimmy nodded. Precisely. When that failed, he orchestrated the captain's discharge under a cloud of suspicion, ruining his military career. I've spent 2 years tracking down the truth, following the captain's trail to Montana. Sarah remembered Robert's nightmares, his reluctance to speak of the war, the way he had flinched when artillery was mentioned. It made a terrible kind of sense. Where are these documents now? Sheriff Thompson asked, ever practical. That's the question, isn't it? Jimmy replied. I had hoped Mrs. Callahan might know. All eyes turned to Sarah, who shook her head slowly. Robert never mentioned any documents. If he brought them home, he never showed them to me. But even as she spoke, a memory surfaced. Robert in his final days, delirious with fever, mumbling about the shepherd's watch and stone sentinels, just as she had told Max. Not fever dreams, after all, but a message he had been trying to convey. The mine, she said suddenly. The abandoned mine with the rock formations called the Sentinels. He must have hidden them there. Jimmy's eyes lit with academic fervor. Can you find this place? Yes, Sarah confirmed. But not until the storm breaks. No one's going anywhere for at least another day. Sheriff Thompson holstered his revolver. Decision made. We'll all head back to the cabin for now. Sort this mess out when the weather clears. He gestured to Max's body. What about him and the others? The storm will bury them, Sarah said, her voice devoid of remorse. Just as they would have buried me. The sheriff nodded, accepting the harsh mountain justice. Let's go then, before we join them. As they made their way back toward the cabin, navigating carefully around the avalanche debris, Sarah found herself walking beside Jimmy. You never intended to harm me, did you? She asked quietly. No, Mrs. Callahan. I only wanted the truth. For my book, yes, but also for history, for justice. And now? Jimmy considered. Now I think perhaps some truths are better left buried with the dead. Your husband was a complex man, hero and sinner both, like most of us. What matters is that he tried to do the right thing in the end. Sarah nodded, finding an unexpected peace in his words. Robert had been flawed, had made mistakes, had perhaps even committed acts he was ashamed of. But he had also loved her, had built a life with her, had died trying to save their son. That was the truth she would preserve. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow, its solid walls promising shelter from the storm that still raged, though with diminishing fury. Sarah paused at the threshold, looking back at the white wilderness that had claimed so many lives, her son, her husband, and now the men who had threatened everything she had left. Are you coming, Mrs. Callahan? Sheriff Thompson asked from the doorway. Sarah nodded, turning away from the storm at last. Yes, she said, I'm coming home. As dawn breaks over the Montana mountains, the storm finally surrenders. The pristine snow reveals no trace of the violence it has witnessed. Nature, in its indifferent mercy, buries both sins and sinners beneath the same white shroud. Sarah Callahan stands on her porch, watching the morning light transform the landscape that nearly became her tomb. The cattle that survived have returned, drawn home by instinct and hunger. Like her, they are fewer now, but unbowed. The truth about Robert remains complicated, hero and flawed man both. His secrets lie buried in these mountains, just as their son does. Some treasures and tragedies are best left undisturbed. Sheriff Thompson tips his hat as he rides away, carrying with him the official story: outlaws caught in a blizzard, justice delivered by the unforgiving hand of nature. The truth, as always in war and its aftermath, is messier, more human. Cole stays behind to help rebuild. His presence a bridge between the past Sarah cannot change and a future she never expected. They say time heals all wounds. But in places like this, where winter rules half the year and memories are etched in blood and snow, perhaps healing isn't about forgetting the wounds at all. Perhaps it's about learning to carry them differently, and in the silence after the storm, finding reasons to continue.